Good morning, everyone, from wherever you may be tuning into this unique and important session at World Knowledge Forum 2020. My name is Ye Kyung-han, Deputy Editor of Mail Business newspaper, and it's my pleasure to moderate this session. I welcome all of you to this session, which brings together experts, renowned economists, and policymakers from across the world to discuss and define what trajectory of the global economy follows and how best to address the deep challenges created by COVID-19 and to contribute to constructive policy responses. 2020 was meant to be a middling year for the global economy with slowing but continuing levels of global growth. But in just a few months, it was turned onto its head by the coronavirus pandemic. And now we are experiencing so-called the deepest recession in 90 years. Yet again, can the global economy recover? To answer this simple but tricky question, I'm joined by two top economists from China and to Korea, Professor Justin Ifo Lin from Peking University and Professor Tongchul Cho from the Korea Development Institute School of Public Policy and Management. First of all, I am so happy to introduce Professor Lin to you. Professor Lin was appointed Chief Economist of the World Bank, where he served from 2008 to 2012. He was the first Chief Economist of the World Bank from a developing country. It was in August 2008 when he was appointed, and in less than 2 months, October 2008, he visited to Korea on his first business trip to Asia. And I was so lucky enough to have an exclusive interview with him at that time. But I still remember how gloomy I felt asking him the question, can the global economy recover? It was only in 3 months, it was only in 3 weeks since the collapse of the Lehman Brothers led us to the tragic financial crisis. And now I'm sitting here to ask him the same question again. So it seems that we are only brought together by economic catastrophe, doesn't it?
Yep.
Yeah, and let me briefly introduce Professor Tongchul Cho to you. Up until April this year, Professor Cho served as a member of the Monetary Policy Board at the Bank of Korea for the last 4 years, which means he had to keep silent for a week per month right before the monthly monetary policy decision-making meeting. But now he's free to talk, say anything to you today. And I heard that he's well known for his singing voice, but today he must use his microphone for any graver reasons. Seriously speaking, I've never met any monetary policy members like Professor Cho who speaks straight away so crystal clear without any ambiguity. And he's the best monetary policy expert as long as I've been reporting here for the Korean financial market for the last 20 years. So please welcome the two economists. A big round of applause. Thank you. Quickly, let me tell you the running order for this session. Before we start to listen to these two economists, we have one more big guest, Angel Gurria, Secretary General of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Secretary General Gurria has kindly sent us a video clip. Currently, he resides in Paris, but unfortunately, he was advised not to travel in order to avoid the spread of the COVID-19. After Secretary General Gurria's message, we move on to the Professor Lin to talk about the Chinese economy after COVID-19 and its impact on the global economy in 2021. And then Professor Cho will talk about how the Korean economy has been struggling with the pandemic in the context of the global economy as well as its road to recovery. So let's meet Secretary General Angel Gurria first.
Dear friends, it is my pleasure to address the 21st World Knowledge Forum on the theme this year of COVID-19 and the new economic normal. The world is in the grip of the worst health, social, and economic crisis of our lifetime. The 6% contraction in global GDP that we projected for 2020 only a few weeks ago in our most recent economic outlook is the largest drop in the 60 years of OECD's existence. Just to put it in context. And in the case of a second wave of infections, global GDP could decline by more than 7.5%. So in just a few months, the pandemic has wiped out the progress in labor markets made over the past decade to recover from the global financial crisis. We were just coming out, and then COVID hit. Let me congratulate Korea for its swift and efficient reaction to contain the spread of COVID-19 using digital tools such as location and symptom tracking. Korea kept the virus at bay without a total lockdown and thereby limiting the economic damage. Still, we expect nearly all OECD countries to experience sharply negative growth this year, followed by a gradual recovery in 2021. Now, while the global economy walks on a tightrope, this crisis is disproportionately affecting the most vulnerable in our societies. As shown in our latest employment outlook, self-employed, temporary, part-time workers account for up to 40% of employment in the most affected sectors. The young are once again at risk of becoming the biggest casualties of the crisis. Youth unemployment in the OECD jumped from 11.3% in February to around 16% or thereabouts in June. This is despite the extraordinary and swift measures taken by most governments to respond to the pandemic. Trillions of dollars have already been directed toward supporting individuals, households, and companies across the OECD through income support and expanded paid sick leave. Moreover, about 60 million workers across the OECD have been included in the initial requests for support by the companies through job retention schemes so that they do not lose the link with the enterprises. Now, although there is a high burden on public debt, we should be careful not to withdraw the emergency measures too quickly. As we address these challenges, we need to start thinking and planning what will be, what I would quote, the new economic normal. Now, we cannot aspire to go back to what we had before the crisis. This time, we need to build back better. Looking ahead, countries must adapt existing measures to encourage a robust, inclusive, and sustainable recovery. Job retention schemes need to be targeted at jobs that are viable in the longer term, while public and private employment services must be scaled up to assist job seekers in finding new work. Moreover, as highlighted in our recent policy brief on youth and COVID-19, response, recovery, and resilience, we must act swiftly to help young people maintain the links with the labor market. In this respect, early outreach is vital to maintain contact with young people who have lost their jobs or left school without finding employment, and to ensure no jobless young person goes without support. There is also an urgent need to ensure that financial markets are well functioning, that they are resilient in order to support a strong economic recovery. This means ensuring that capital is efficiently allocated to the most productive firms and the most productive uses in the economy. In addition, corporate defaults can be expected to rise above the levels experienced in the global financial crisis. It is therefore imperative that governments put risk capital to use for businesses in need of temporary support, to contribute to employment and the wider economic recovery. For example, with appropriate program design, equity investments could reduce the probability of default without undue burden on governments. They can also foster investments that will generate long-term value, such as research and development, and also in intangible assets. The COVID-19 crisis has also amplified calls for resilience and preparedness to deal with future shocks. It remains paramount to address our systemic vulnerabilities, to strengthen our agility, and improve our anticipation. Consider our interconnected infrastructure systems, for example. Water, energy, transport, telecom. When those services are disrupted by a flood, a cyber attack, or an accident, cascading failures can lead to large knock-on effects. The OECD, through its policy toolkit on governance for critical infrastructure resilience, is supporting countries to better understand these complex interdependencies, these complex vulnerabilities across infrastructure systems, so that they can prioritize the efforts to make them more resilient. And above all, we need the strength that comes from multilateralism. Stronger international cooperation will help us end the COVID-19 crisis, speed up the recovery, and prevent future crises from taking hold. This is precisely where concerted action comes in, such as the sharing of knowledge and of medical and financial resources, and the reduction of harmful bans on trade, especially in healthcare products. And last but not least, in the midst of the current crisis, the world has not escaped from worsening climate change and severe biodiversity losses. They keep on happening. Without significant changes to our economic systems, the social and economic impacts of these crises will be long-lasting and will unquestionably eclipse those of COVID-19. We must therefore absolutely ensure that the recovery goes hand in hand with our green efforts. Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, we need a new normal. We need a better normal. We need systems that are more resilient to future shocks. We need more inclusive and sustainable economic systems. And for that, we need to change our theoretical frameworks. We need to change our policies. We need to change the standards with which we are working. We urgently need to change course. And we can only do it if we act together. Because each country has a hand on the steering wheel. This is why multilateral cooperation is the only way out and the only way forward. Together, we will learn more. Together, we will achieve more. Together, we will succeed. Count on the OECD in this endeavor. And thank you.
Thank you. It was such a powerful message encouraging us to engage in international cooperation during this hard time. Let's move on to the Chinese economy. If you could please join me in welcoming Professor Lin.
Friends, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor for me to participate in the World Knowledge Forum again. And this time, I'm going to talk about Chinese economy after COVID-19 and its implication for the global economy in 2021. First, I'd like to mention, this is the first time for the Chinese government not to target a specific growth rate in its annual report to the People's Congress in March. Certainly, it was due to the COVID-19 outbreak. However, the Chinese government pledged to double GDP and income per person on the basis of 2010 by the time of the 2020. And the Chinese government described this as the centennial goals of the government. And also, the Chinese government pledged to help all poor people to get out of poverty by the end of this year in the 19th Party Congress in 2017. And to achieve those targets, it is necessary for China to grow at 5.3% this year. Normally, 5.3% of growth is not so difficult for China to achieve. As you know, the average annual growth rate for China in the past 4 decades was 9.4%. However, the unexpected outbreak of the COVID-19 at the end of January, causing the shutting down of the factory all over China. And all people sheltering at home in February and most part of March. As a result, Chinese economy certainly was hit hardly. And in the first quarter, the growth rate was negative 6.8%. And it was the worst performance in China since 1978. Luckily, like Korea, China contained the outbreak of pandemic quite effectively. So in the second quarter of this year, gradually the production and the life returned to normal. So the growth rate for the second quarter in China was 3.2%. And on the average, the first half of the year, the growth rate was negative 1.6%. And with this, if China wants to achieve those growth targets, as I mentioned, China needs to have a 12.2% growth in the second half of this year to achieve 5.3% annual growth in 2020. As the insiders of China, I think if the Chinese government really wants to achieve its growth and our target pledged in the 18th Party Congress or 19th Parties Congress, it's possible. The main reason for my confidence is that China has ample policy space for the government to stimulate the economy. First, if you look at the monetary policy side, currently the interest rate for the banking sectors and so on, it's as high as 4 percentage points. And we know that in most advanced countries, the interest rate now is 0 or negative. So certainly, there's a huge scope for the Chinese government to lower the interest rate to stimulate the investment and the consumption. And not only the interest rate, the reserve ratio in China today is as high as 11%. Then we know that the normal requirement for the banking sectors, the reserve ratio is 8%. So China can lower the reserve ratio to increase the credit availability to the enterprises and households. Not only the monetary policy, for the fiscal policy side, the Chinese government also has a huge role. Currently, the accumulated debt of the Chinese government, including the central government and local government. And in local government, I also include the implicit debt, that is debt to the investment vehicles, but guaranteed by the local governments. The total amount is 60%, 60% of the Chinese GDP. But we know in most advanced countries, their debt to GDP ratio is as high as 100%, and like in the case of US, 130%, in the case of Japan, 260%. So the Chinese government can use fiscal space to stimulate the investment and consumption in China. And also China is a middle-income country. There are many good opportunities to investment. For example, China can upgrade the telecommunication system from 4G to 5G. China can further improve the connectivity between cities and to firm, the urban agglomeration and so on. So if China put all those efforts, I think it's possible for China to grow at 12.2% in the second half of this year and achieve 5.3% growth as desired. However, it's possible, but may not be desirable. The main reason is about the uncertainty brought out by the COVID-19. We know that US is still in the first wave of the hit, and now already 6.8 million people, were infected, and more than 20,000 people died because of the COVID-19. And India, South Asia, it already has about 5.1 million people were, infected, and in Brazil, 4.4 million people were infected. And they are still in the first wave of outbreak. And a similar situation, still happening in Africa and so on. And for Europe, although it already passed the first wave, but there's a danger of second wave of outbreak. And from the past experiences we know, unless we have effective vaccines, otherwise a second wave, third wave hit would be possible. And the second wave or the third wave, it could be even more serious than the first wave. And we also know, unless all the countries in the world control the pandemic, otherwise we cannot call to have a victory after of the pandemic. And so there's a lot of uncertainty. And currently, the global economy is very gloomy. And likely, the situation may be prolonged to the next year or even beyond. So under the kind of situation, it would be better for the Chinese government to reserve some policy space for the future, instead of using all the policy space this year. And under this kind of scenario, what would be the likely growth for China? From my personal point of view, I think it's most likely China this year will grow around 3%. The main reason is that the Chinese government in a place to help all the poor people get out of poverty. For that, job would be necessary. And you need to have the growth momentum to maintain job, to help the poor people. And 3% growth would be necessary for the target of poverty elimination. And secondly, the Chinese government pledged the doubling of the GDP and people's income is a centennial goal. And a centennial goal means, Chinese Communist Party was established in 1921. And the centennial celebration is next year, 2021. And so if China grows at 3% this year, and next year, if the global economy recovers, China may bounce back to 8 or 10% growth. Certainly, then it will be very easy for China to realize those doubling goals. But even the global economy is still very gloomy. I think that China will have enough space to grow at 3% and to double China's GDP and per capita income by the time of the celebration for the 100 years of the Communist Party. And so most likely, I expect China to grow at about 3% this year. And certainly, if China grows at 3% this year, it will be the worst performance since the reform and opening up in 1978. However, comparatively with other countries, we know that US will grow, according to the IMF prediction, negative 8% this year. And it was a prediction in June, and if we see the prediction in September, it can be even worse. But just assume the US growth this year is negative 8%. That means the gap between the China's growth and the US growth will be 11%. And this kind of growth gap, it's even larger than the normal year. The normal year, China may grow at about 10%, and the US may grow at about 3 to 3.5%, and the gap may be only 7% or 6.5%. But this year, if China grows at 3%, the growth gap will be 11%. And similarly, the Eurozone this year, according to the IMF, is likely to grow at negative 10.2%. So that means if China grows at 3%, then China is 13% ahead of the European growth rate. So by that, certainly, China is the most dynamically growing country in the world. And China will still be the driver of the growth of the world. And for the next year, 2021, I can say a similar thing. As I said, if the global economy bounce back, according to IMF prediction, the world economy this year will be negative 4.9%, and next year is likely to be bounce back to 5%. But the Chinese economy, according to the IMF prediction, its growth is likely to be 8%, but in the past, IMF systematically underestimate the growth of China. As an insider, I think if the global economy bounce back, most likely next year China's growth rate will be between 8 to 10%. Again, China will be the fastest growing economy in the world. We know that since 2008, China each year contributed about 30% growth to the global growth. And I think this year and the coming years, China will continue to contribute 30% to the global growth. And China will still be the driver of the growth in the world and provide opportunity not only for China, but for the business community in the world, including business community in Korea. So let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Lin. Professor Lin says the coronavirus has something negative effects on the Chinese economy, but we will see the sustainable growth in the future. So now, can we listen to Professor Zhou, please?
Thank you, Yegang, for inviting me to this prestigious conference. It is surely my honor to be a part of this conference, but I also have to say that it is the most difficult and embarrassing time for a macroeconomist like me to talk about the economic outlook. Given that the COVID-19 is the predominant factor affecting economic activities, probably a healthy economist is better than a macroeconomist in groping around for our future. With all reservations like this, let me briefly talk about the global economic outlook in the order of the following three questions. First, whether we have passed the bottom. Second, how fast the recovery would be. And third, whether the pre-pandemic trajectory of growth can be restored after the crisis is over. And then I will present my own view on the Korean economy with the similar logic context. First, to the question whether the global economy passed the bottom, I would say yes, it did in the previous second quarter. Of course, I don't want to exclude the possibility of second or third waves of pandemic, but I do believe that economies tend to respond most frantically when the shock is unanticipated and never experienced. In other words, when the COVID-19 first hit the economy early this year, neither individuals nor government knew much about how to cope with it. But as the situation is prolonged, society has learned how to adapt themselves and how to control, at least the psychological panics. And thus, the economic impact of another possible wave, in my view, is likely to be smaller than the first one. For this reason, I expect, after a historic GDP loss of around 10% in the second quarter, the global economy can now begin to escape from the panic at least. Regarding the second issue of recovery pace, however, I expect it will be just moderate. We already fell down to an incredibly low level of GDP, and thus just a partial recovery may look like a V-shape graphically. But a more meaningful measure of a recovery pace would be how long it takes until the pre-crisis level is restored. The pandemic does not seem to extinguish soon of itself, and even though vaccines become available within this year, it will take some time, possibly a full year, until the pre-pandemic health condition is fully recovered. In this regard, I agree with the projections of IMF and OECD that the global economy will not recover the pre-crisis level by next year. Aside from the health condition, I would like to emphasize structural flexibilities as another important factor that will affect the recovery paces of respective economies. We all agree that this pandemic will bring about the structural changes in many respects, such as the rise of untech businesses and home works. And many economists would also agree that structural flexibilities are crucial for an economy to quickly adapt to a new environment. As a reference for this issue, we can recall the recovery period after the global financial crisis. It took 2 years in the United States until the pre-crisis level of GDP is recovered, but more than 5 years in the euro area. I believe that the relatively delayed recovery of Europe at that time was largely due to its relatively rigid economic structures and inefficient macro policy coordination processes. If the economic structures in these regions have not much changed since then, a similar pattern of uneven recoveries can possibly emerge again. To the third question, whether the pre-pandemic trajectory of growth can be restored after the crisis, empirical research suggests that the answer is not really positive. Economies suffering from full-scale crises, such as Latin American countries after the debt crisis, Asian economies after the currency crisis, and even advanced countries after the global financial crisis, all of them have slowed their growth paces after the crisis. It is not all that clear why this should be the case theoretically, but our past experiences seem to cast some gloomy shadows over the long-term outlook of the global economy. Having this kind of story in mind about the global economic outlook, let me now turn to the Korean economy. Korea has performed relatively well so far. Of course, Korea was no exception in suffering from the pandemic. Consumption collapsed with the social distancing policy, and export contracted as global demand shrank. However, Korea has contained the spread of COVID-19 without total lockdowns, mainly thanks to the broad-based and effective medical system. And therefore, the damage on consumption was less severe than in other advanced economies. With the help of aggressive fiscal and monetary policies, it now appears that Korea's domestic demand has slowly climbed up since April, while export, which is tightly geared to the global economic cycle, is expected to recover from the third quarter. The recent recovery of China, the biggest export market of Korea, should also help our export performance in the near future. It is true that the recent re-wave of COVID-19 in Korea will adversely affect consumption again, but for the reasons I mentioned earlier regarding recurrent shocks, I do not expect Korea's economic activities to contract as much as in the second quarter. All in all, it seems possible for now to restrain a GDP loss of this year within 2% in Korea. What I'm concerned about, however, is the resiliency of the Korean economy. Korea used to be very dynamic and resilient in the past. We achieved a brisk recovery after the currency crisis in the late 1990s and relatively fast recovery after the global financial crisis a decade ago. However, over the past some years, regulations, particularly in the labor market and housing market, have been seriously overloaded. For example, as a result of a series of additional regulations in the labor market, firms now can hardly adjust workers' working time to business conditions, not to mention employment adjustment. Restrictions to residential redevelopment that have been only strengthened for years are significantly depressing housing supplies and related businesses despite the increase in demand generated by the low interest rate policy. These overloaded regulations will clearly hinder efficient resource allocations of the economy, weakening the dynamism that the Korean economy used to be known for. Especially when the environment changes so drastically just like now, the negative effects of heavy regulations can be amplified by disturbing firms' swift adjustment to the new normal brought by the pandemic. In this respect, I feel like Korea's economic system is kind of inclining toward the European model rather than the US one, the implication of which regarding economic resiliency was mentioned earlier. Considering this structural policy development in Korea, added on to the ongoing rapid aging of the Korean society and a cloudy long-term prospect of the global economy, I will not be surprised too much, even though the Korea's average growth rate for the next 5 years falls below 2%. That's it for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Cho. So based on what we've heard from these two economists, I've got a hunch that we won't see the future turning out quite so bad. But back in March, in the US as well as in the Eurozone, market economists said, quote unquote, the deepest recession in about 90 years since the Great Depression. So when the global economy has come to a shuddering halt. So I have a question for you too. Can we expect this recession to be the shortest ever? Maybe Professor Lin first?
I think it will be much shorter than the Great Depression because we know that Great Depression did not recover fully until the start of the Second World War. And it took more than 10 years. But this time, I think we learned lessons from the Great Depression. And the governments in the world know how to use its policy space, both fiscal policy and the monetary policy to help the country to recover. And also we have more effective global institutions like IMF, like the World Bank, like a regional development bank to support the health of the poor people and the recovery of the global economy. So I think that the rebound will be much faster than the Great Depression. Hopefully next year, if not the year after next, certainly with the condition that we have vaccines that is available for everyone in the world.
Okay.
Well, I basically agree with Professor Lin in that this recession can be absolutely shorter than the Great Depression period. But it kind of depends on how you define recession, right? I mean, common definition of a recession is 2 consecutive quarters negative growth. By that standard, I would say from the 3rd or 4th quarter of this year, we can escape from the recession period.
Right.
Given that we already fell down so deeply, right? So yeah, I think this recession, according to that definition, will be short. But as I said earlier, predominant factor is the development of COVID-19, and no one knows exactly how it will proceed. Therefore, I should be a little bit cautious.
Okay, I see. So those are the answers that will directly link to my next question. But we see an increasingly puzzling picture of the economy recovering faster than ever expected. So particularly in US, we see massive unemployment hit, as well as the inflation rate picking up at the same time. We're back in August. So in this multifaceted crisis, what signs should we be looking for when it comes to a recovery? So that in your terms, in economist terms, where should we see the green shoots?
Well, should I go first now?
Yeah, in reverse order, maybe.
All right. First, I don't think inflation has picked up yet. In the case of the United States, it is true that the August number was slightly picking up, but I think that was largely due to exchange rate movement. If you look at the inflation number of Euro, then you cannot find any upward movement in inflation.
Right.
So I don't think inflation has picked up globally yet. In any case, to the question of yours, what would be the green shoot? I mean, that is a very tricky question. At this point, at this moment, definitely a good news on the COVID-19 should be a green shoot, right? Something like good news about the vaccine development. But other than that, if you want me to talk about the economic indicators, then I would look at the some short-term indicators about the travel or entertainment. They should reflect the most sensitively the consumer sentiment that was most severely hit by the pandemic.
Great. What about you, Professor Lin?
I agree with Professor Cho, and certainly, if we talk about recession, according to the definition, China has already get out of recession because we already had the recovery, and we're likely to continue the recovery. And I think a similar situation certainly will happen in Europe and to some degree also in the US. But in terms of the green shoot, consumer sentiment certainly is a very important indicator. But as we agree, unless we have the vaccines effectively can control the pandemic. But there's always some kind of second hit or third hit. And so, the indication of effective vaccine will be very important for the sustainability of recovery in this pandemics. But at the same time, I think that even we control the pandemic, but we may still grow below the potential. Like after the 2008 financial crisis, if you use the definition, certainly US seems to be returned to normal now, or before COVID hit. But before 2008, the US growth rate on the average was about 3% to 3.5% annually. But after the hit of the 2008 crisis, the US, the growth rate is growing below its potential of 3%. Even last year, it was only 2.7%. And even without the COVID-19, the prediction for the growth of the US this year by IMF was 2%. So it's also important to think, how can we really recover fully to our growth potential after the hit of crisis? And for this, some kind of green recovery as advocated by Secretary General Gurria will be important, and other structural reform in the economy would also be essential for an economy to fully recover to its growth potential.
And none of us have seen anything like this pandemic. And there's no playbook for this. And there's no monopoly on wisdom. So that's why we get together today and share our knowledge in this forum. So once again, thank you all you to to sharing your time, Professor Lin and Professor Cho. And thank you so much for joining us today on site as well as on the web. So stay tuned till next year. Thank you.